Brett, how has the role of a CISO evolved since you first entered the cybersecurity field?
Oh, since I entered the cybersecurity field, or since Steve Katz became the first CISO at Citigroup?
If you don't want to show your age, you don't have to. You don't have to go back. You can go back however far you want to.
Yeah, I mean, so if we go back there, and I think that's a good way to look at it, is because it was 1995. So I've been in IT and cybersecurity for a long time, where he became the very first CISO for Citigroup, and I think we kind of went backwards, and now we're starting to move forward again. And the reason I say that is because obviously for them to appoint Steve Katz as the cybersecurity leader for Citigroup, now Citibank, he would have had to have had a level of executive leadership buy-in, executive leadership support. And I think that's where the role has deteriorated since then, is that cybersecurity has been kind of isolated from the rest of the business and less acknowledged by senior leadership in a lot of cases. It wasn't that long ago when it was like, okay, well, we need antivirus. Okay, well, here's your antivirus. Why? Because we got hit with the I love you virus. Okay, well, let's get antivirus. And then it's been whack-a-mole ever since. And a lot of the CISOs came up from those IT / developer / data center type people. And that's kind of where they stayed, and that mentality stayed with them. So the way that I see it going is that with a lot of attention being paid, a lot of new regulations, a lot of states are adopting privacy acts like CPRA, which used to be CCPA over in California. There's a lot of those coming along, and the SEC with the security ruling and the notification rule that they came out with. So a lot of executives are not only being put on the chopping block, if you remember SolarWinds and Uber and some other ones. This is driving that executive leadership acknowledgement of the importance of cybersecurity and understanding that cybersecurity risk is business risk. So with that, the CISOs have got to adapt to that way of thinking and that way of dealing with cybersecurity.
Do you think that in the boardroom there was some tolerance in the beginning for more technical focused people, because cybersecurity is like this thing that is up and coming? We're learning. The technical people have the great understanding of cybersecurity, but then they realize that no, we need some great leadership here. And so there's been a transition over the years to the fact that, okay, it's been around for a while. Do we have better business leaders, more so than technical practitioners that have morphed into CISOs? Like, what are your thoughts there?
So I think the boards and executive leadership it had been more of like an ignorance thing because they didn't understand the technical details. So it might have been like head nodding. This is why we are high risk, because I said so and I've been around a long time. And they're like, okay, well, I trust that. But nowadays, especially with the push for at least one senior level security person being on the board, I think we have to learn to explain that in more business terms. And I think we're getting there.
If I was aspiring to be a CISO or cybersecurity leader, what advice would you have for me today?
Run? No. I guess the advice that I would have overall is a lot of it, the majority of it is about culture, right? So I've seen a lot of CISOs go in with guns blazing, trying to boil the ocean, trying to force cybersecurity awareness and big changes and stuff like that, get thrown out because they didn't first pay attention to the culture, right? And that's critical. So when I go into an organization as their virtual CISO, one of the first things I do while I'm gathering the information is I'm learning personalities. I'm learning the culture. I'm learning what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what are the ultimate expectations, and building the program from there. Because without acceptance, people will shut down. The minute they feel resistance or the minute they feel they're being intimidated, they will shut down on you and you'll never get anything out of them. And that is a recipe for disaster for a CISO. So learning the business culture, understanding the business, understanding how they make money, understanding what their processes are and that sort of thing. And that's kind of foundational because from that you build an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish and what's most critical to the business and what exactly to protect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. When you're advising companies, what's the most common mistake you see organizations make when building their security programs?
Throwing tools at the wall and hoping they stick?
You mean this tool that I bought is not going to solve all my problems?
No. And that's partially because of the manufacturing industry or the solutions that have all the buzzwords and stuff like that. This will fix this will fix that. We have, you want zero trust, buy this product, things like that. And they put it in and it just seems to escalate from there because we're always still playing whack-a-mole, So there's new technologies, adversaries hit us where it hurts. We adapt, and we just do that. But one of the most fundamental things that is missed is understanding where your critical data is. Do you know where all your assets are? Do you know where your critical assets are? It's like learning what the crown jewels of your organization are. And the basis for that is what would happen if X was taken away? How much would the company lose per day or per week or per month? And, that's where the big problems start is we don't understand where our data is. And it's understandable because prior to like DSPM, Data Security Posture Manager, where it would go out and it would find and classify all your data, it was an extremely daunting task to manually go out and search for your data and understand what it was, why it was there, who had access to it, why they had access to it and all that stuff. So
yeah, if you're coming into an organization, you're advising them and you want to know where those critical assets are, where do you start? What do you ask for?
Well, first you have to understand the business. So when you understand the business, how they do business, then you understand what they collect, whether it's PII, whether it's PHI, or whether it's PCI data. That's the starting point, is just basically understanding the business. How do you do business? And then you can understand through that process what their critical data is. And then, you have to go find it. So is it in a data lake? Is it in an S3 bucket in AWS or something like that? And then I still think the best way to do it is the DSPM solution, to go out, find it, classify it. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done after that, but at least you can understand what the data is, what the classification level is, and actually who owns it, so you can take steps to say, hey, why is this credit card data out on an S3 bucket that shouldn't be there? Can we delete it? Or if you're talking about GDPR, are we way over our retention limits, and those types of things.
When you're working with companies that don't have a CISO, what's typically their biggest security blind spot?
The fact that they don't have a CISO.
They have you.
Yeah. I would say, again, the whole governance thing, it's building that cohesiveness between executive leadership and the cybersecurity team. The blind spots probably, again, are the data, the lack of understanding where the data is. A lot of times it'll be, vulnerability management. They have, a vulnerability management solution, but they're not necessarily prioritizing correctly. So there is gaping holes with currently being exploited vulnerabilities sitting out there because they're freaking out over the 500 critical vulnerabilities that are before that, things like that.
Yeah, we many times as the offensive security provider, ask our customers like, hey, like, what are you working on? What's priority? And then after we start engaging, doing the testing, it's like, well, here's all the things that were either not on your radar, or we chain together a bunch of lower severity vulnerabilities to create a critical risk here. And the main takeaway is that, just echoing your statement, is that the prioritizing what they should be working on, what they should be fixing, is usually never as accurate as organizations want it to be. We come in and help provide a little additional threat intelligence information and show the impact, and help prioritize and validate all those things. But is that something that you mentioned you commonly see, that vulnerability management, the prioritization is the tricky part? Is there any tips and tricks that you have for those people listening out there? It's like, yeah, I have that problem in my organization. Anything that you could advise them on?
Yeah, and don't let me get away from what you were just talking about, threat intelligence. And I don't know why I do this. I do this with this incident response because it's one of my biggest things that I talk about. But yeah, so first of all, understand your assets, right? Understand where that critical data is. Where is it sitting? What are the vulnerabilities on that asset? And focus on vulnerabilities that have public exploits, are currently being exploited in the wild, those types of things, and patching those. But obviously, first, you need to make sure that you understand your overall exposure. So you understand where you're most exposed, and that's usually at the edge. It's usually a website with a form on it or something like that. So one of the other things that I really want to bring up is the fact that whether you're a small company or whether you're an enterprise, a large enterprise company, one of the best things that you can do is formulate an incident response plan and practice it, right? And there's two reasons for that. One is to build a solid cybersecurity program can take a long time, especially when you are trying to work with a culture that is somewhat adverse to that sort of thing. And it can take a while. So the best thing you can do is formulate, write an incident response plan and exercise it. You need to make sure that you're building in that muscle memory, because when it hits, the adrenaline starts pumping and your mind goes blank. I'm sure everybody's experienced that. So, and what we talk about there is we talk about reducing the blast radius, right? If we have a good incident response plan, we've practiced it, then we know where our entry points are. We know where the segmentation is. We know what to shut down first or, cut off first, whether it be cutting off a port to a segment, to isolate the segment. And then, probably like make sure you have playbooks so you know how to eradicate whatever is in there, from ransomware or info stealing malware or things like that.
Yeah. Do you find that a lot of organizations even have incident response plans that you're advising as a VC?
I do. Yeah, I do. I've written a bunch of incident response plans for that reason. And, sometimes I'll get like an incident response plan that just it isn't complete. It's got the basics on there where it would rate the incident level and the severity and all that, but there's no communication plan, right? There's no out-of-band communication plan. There's no senior leadership piece to it. Like there's no process or workflow to incorporate. So we want to call XYZ first. We want to call our CISO, then our chief legal counsel, our head of HR, depending, our public relations person. We want to call our local FBI contact, have that call tree and have everybody understand what that call tree is, and that's the biggest thing that lacks. And it goes right back up to what I was saying earlier, governance, senior executive buy-in and all that. But it's critical to have that plan. And that's what a lot of them are missing.
Yeah. And, you mentioned that you got to practice the plan? Like, is there a certain frequency, certain style or way to go ahead and test that? Is that tabletop exercises? What advice would you give if I have a plan, but it's just sitting on the shelf, the digital shelf, getting dusty? How do I test that? How do I run through a practice round?
So I think there's two methods that we use anyway. There is an executive level method, which I think is really good, where you get all of the leaders in the room and you run through a ransomware attack. So you'll have a company set up a scenario for you, and they'll build out the entire scenario, and you don't really know what the scenario is. And then we all sit down in a room and we talk it through from a leadership perspective, because the consequences for some breaches in some organizations are vast, and they're going to affect CEO, CFO, CIO, chief legal, all those people. So that's one method. The other method is more of a technical method where you really get the technologists or the threat hunters or the threat intel teams actually going through the motions. And that's where they build up that muscle memory with all different kinds of scenarios, depending on their organization, usually, sure, they should have a sim, and, they should understand their entry points and that sort of thing, and how they go about finding and isolating and containing and eradicating the threat.
Listen, if you made it this far, I'm just going to ask you for one favor. Most of you listening right now haven't subscribed. Go ahead, feed that algorithm, and support us by clicking subscribe. Doing so allows me to bring you great content and allows us to bring more exceptional guests onto the podcast. Go ahead, hit subscribe. I appreciate it. What's your approach to balancing security requirements with business objectives?
So that goes back to understanding the business, right? Aligning yourself with the business is critical. So understanding what all the processes are. Ooh, we have HR, what does HR do? What does finance do? What do they interact with? And that sort of thing. And then building the program around that, because again, that will tell you what the most critical process is, where the most critical areas are. So with that, and also making sure that you are building those business relationships with those business leaders, with finance, with legal, with the CEO, CIO, those types of things, and really understanding what their objectives are from a business perspective, and then making sure that you are protecting what they most care about.
Got it. What are some red flags you look for when assessing the organization's security posture for the first time? So you just entered the organization and you need to kind of figure out what maturity or what does the posture look like? Where do you start?
Usually a red flag is that there's no structure. I could go back to governance again and say that's obviously a red flag, but no structure. They don't understand what they're trying to protect. They haven't mapped critical data to business function, that sort of thing. From an even more granular perspective, there are instances where organizations don't have a vulnerability management program. They don't have a security awareness training program. They don't have, they haven't adopted endpoint detection and response. They're still using 6-character passwords, or 8-character passwords rather. Things like that. Those are definitely all red flags.
Are you still finding those in organizations?
Yes.
Okay.
Believe it or not. I think everybody's on the EDR, on the endpoint detection and response bandwagon now, so that's pretty good. But there's a lot of false sense of security in a lot of that stuff. And a lot of organizations feel that if they have endpoint detection and response, they have training, they have firewalls at the edge, that sort of thing, that they're good. But, we never know when the next information stealing malware is going to hit, or some crazy artificial intelligence crafted email is going to come along, and they've crafted it in such a way that it can bypass our email detection measures for links and that sort of thing. So
Do you find certain sectors or certain industries struggle a little bit more to be brought up to the modern age for cybersecurity defenses?
yeah, I think healthcare struggles, and it shows if you look at like Verizon data breach investigation report or the Punnell Institute's cost of the data breach. Healthcare, manufacturing, which all you have to do is you have to look at those reports to determine what industry is suffering the most, because they know, right? They struggle with finances a lot of times. They struggle with budget, getting budget to really tighten things up. And manufacturing is still, ever since manufacturing went OT and IoT, where everything's internet connected now, they struggle with that as well. So
Yeah, the attack surface is changing, and those organizations are, already struggling in those industries. And so when things are changing and people are implementing stuff much faster and changing that attack surface, it's hard to keep up when you still have some legacy controls in place.
yeah.
Let's go back to vulnerability prioritization, because we touched on it a little bit. How would you approach that if you had limited resources? Because I think that is a struggle that I hear from many smaller organizations, at least. It's like, we just lack the resources to kind of manage and prioritize these vulnerabilities. What should we do?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the fact that when you first, depending on the size of the company too, but when you first plug in a vulnerability scanner and you get back the results, it's massively overwhelming, right? And then so what a lot of them do is they'll say, okay, well, let's attack the high risk or the critical vulnerabilities first. Okay, but now you have 1,000 of them, and they keep coming in every day.
Yep.
So how do you attack that, right? So there's several different resources, like CISA has the database, the NIST database, to keep an eye on exploitable vulnerabilities if your vulnerability scanner doesn't have those. Again, it's about knowing what assets you have, what software you have, how critical they are to the business, and whether or not there's an exploitable vulnerability on them. Grab those first. And that may be all that you do, but at least you're reducing the attack surface by eliminating those exploitable vulnerabilities. Yes, there's going to be other vulnerabilities that, if it's usually an exploitable vulnerability that is there before they start to move laterally and exploit other vulnerabilities.
So is it okay to reach out and get some help, some third-party support if you feel like you can't keep your head above water?
Well, I think that's what you got to do. I mean, there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of companies out there that can come in and help you sort through that. And a lot of times it's not just the vulnerabilities. It's just the massive amounts of data, or say it's cloud. We rushed into the cloud and we didn't really know what we're doing because it was 10 years ago, and all of our data is up there, right? We have 10 million vulnerabilities in the cloud. You need some kind of help at that point, right? So yeah, I mean, it absolutely makes sense for that. And for anything else, I mean, smaller organizations, it's like, let's get structured. Let's have a structured approach to cybersecurity, right? Let's grab a framework, grab a NIST framework, grab, NIST CSF, or, if you want to work on your maturity, grab CIS version 8.1 is out now. Grab that, work on your maturity. With CIS, you can take implementation group 1. This is where we want to be. Okay. So let's follow this. Or, ISO. I even have customers, even though ISO is a European standard and you can get certified in it, then it almost becomes a compliance mandate if you're getting certified because you're paying all that money and they actually perform an audit. But at its basis, it's a voluntary framework. And I see a lot of customers moving towards that as well. And the one thing I like about that is the fact that it's really strong in the governance side. So it really forces that leadership to be involved in that whole process.
Is there any type of audits and assessments that every company should be doing?
Yes. One of those three things, right? So outside of compliance, here's my take on compliance, right? It's mandated and they're following a good path as far as like structure and completeness and things like that. But compliance frameworks, mandates, however you want to say it, are usually very specific, right? And there again is that false sense of security where we're PCI compliant, so we're good. Now, PCI DSS has one of the most, it is probably the most thorough framework that I've seen, right? But it focuses on payment card data. So outside of that, payment card data is not in scope, right? So you may be missing the entire other half of the organization. So that's why I really push like a holistic approach. You have to go through that, but let's take like a NIST CSF and let's follow it and go through it and, build these controls out. Take like an 830 for your risk assessment, understand what your threats are, what threats are out there. And I can talk a lot about that whole risk process and the very beginning, the foundation of it, but not to get too far off track. Because as you go through those non-regulatory frameworks, which are a lot less stressful, you cover a lot of those different requirements from a controls perspective and from a governance perspective that you would see in your compliance.
Got it. And, we like to talk about PCI a lot, but,
I don't. I was a QSA.
Oh, reformed QSA. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of companies and, rightfully so, because they have a lot of different compliances that they need to go through. But a lot of them are looking to, reduce the scope of that, right? Or how do we transfer the risk so we have go, right? And you bring up a good point where, that can give you a false sense of security and saying, hey, here's PCI. It's a great one, right? We're compliant, right? But well, if you missed like 70% of the organization and definitely some other controls that are not included in there, then like, right? You think you're good, but maybe you're not.
Well, it's the same thing with HIPAA too, right? They're looking for patient health information. And so they're looking for the systems that store patient health information, process patient health information, transfer patient health information. But that's not to say that somebody didn't change positions, move to a different part of the organization and have tons and tons of patient health information on their laptops or something like that. It's so that holistic security approach will cover a lot of those issues where we run into that.
And Brett, what metrics do you find to be most valuable when you're measuring the effectiveness of like a security program?
So mean time to detect and mean time to resolve are pretty important because it shows gaps in that incident response process, right? And that's where you can really fine tune that incident response process. Another one is vulnerability burn down. So, understanding what you're resolving or what you're remediating is really important. And those obviously we're talking about like a boardroom deck, right? So we would have those depending on, each quarter we'll do, a burn down of them, percentage of remediated high risk vulnerabilities. And then obviously, how are we doing from a security awareness training standpoint? Are we going up? Are we going down? Are users showing signs of acceptance of this awareness program that we have? And then the phishing simulations. how are we reacting as a whole to these phishing simulations? And that's really important because it illustrates where people's minds are. If people are clicking on links, but they've done the training and now they're still clicking on links, is it like something that maybe we need to find a different approach? And I just went through this. I don't want to bring up a specific company, but one of the training companies, security awareness training company, came out with videos, season 1, episode 1 type videos, right? And they kind of draw you in, and they're only 7 to 10 minutes long, but they draw you in. And I think it reaches a different part of the psychological processing that people do. And, I'm hoping that that's going to provide something different than glazing over at the same old training day after day. But each one of the videos teaches you something different. And to go along with that, I think a lot of people can really visualize too. When they see it in action, they're like, oh, that's what that means. It's like you'll see on regular training, watch out for piggybacking. Okay, what does that even mean? How do you do that? And it may even say someone following you in from the street or something like that. But when you actually watch a video that you're getting into and you see that happen, you're like, I know what that is. That's piggyback. You just got in. And now I know why that's critical, because not only did he get in, but he got a job. And now he's working on their cybersecurity team, exfiltrating data. So, it's things like that. I mean, it goes back to those really understanding the culture thing and really understanding people as well. You really have to understand people and how they think and how they react to different things and try to adapt for that.
Yeah. And that's a good segue to, another question I had for you, Brett, which is like, how do you build that culture of security awareness that goes beyond that compliance training? And you mentioned these videos, which sound really intriguing, but yeah, how do you build that culture beyond that training program?
The culture, it starts like with any relationship, right? You have to build trust and credibility up front, and then take it slow. Don't try to push things down people's throats. Help them understand why what they're doing and what we're asking of them is important. A lot of times you can relate it to their personal lives, and I think that's where it hits home too, is if they understand how it could potentially impact their personal lives. You tell them, have a 12-character password, username, 12-character password, but that's what because that's policy. But then they go and they use it somewhere else and that company gets breached and they have their data. Now it's not only them or the company that's affected, but it could be their personal lives that are affected because they use that same username and password or use the same email password or whatever.
Yeah. And how do organizations like without massive security budgets stay ahead of, the latest threats?
Pretty much the basics. You've probably heard this a million times, is we get away from the basics.
We do.
And so, understand your perimeter and know like what's most exposed and make sure that you're patching, making sure that your employees understand the risk and, have an endpoint detection and response solution, have a incident response plan. Those things aren't, they're not all that expensive. And build that culture of that security aware culture, get people fired up about, hey, I got that. I got that link and I didn't click on it. Nice try, get them all excited about stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the basics. And like I said, take like a CIS, Center for Internet Security, CIS version 8.1, download it for free and look at implementation group 1 and go through it. You don't have to have a budget to do that. It's free.
Brett, what's the most creative attack technique you've encountered in your career?
Let's see. There's a lot of them, but I think there's one that sticks out more than the others. And that is in 2024, the Japanese company got hit with a deepfake scenario where they assumed the identities of the executive leadership on this Zoom call and was able to have them exfiltrate $25 million out of the organization because everybody on the Zoom call, they allegedly all knew each other. So it was just a deep fake, but it worked. That was pretty clever. It was pretty gutsy, but it was pretty clever. So that's probably one of the biggest ones. I think we're going to see a lot more of that too.
Yeah. And I might have even said it on this podcast before, but like, I feel like we're going to have to, in the corner, have like some sort of hash or some sort of thing to kind of represent. And that won't even do it. Like, we'll have to sign the actual image in real time or some way actually, saying, this is really Casey, this is really Brett.
Yeah. Or have like, a piece of paper with a 25-digit number on it. All right, let me see if that's the right one. Yep. Yeah. After about 10 minutes. Yeah, it's you.
Right. Yeah. You have to start asking people to do silly things, right?
Yeah.
Go grab a coworker and have them, hold up 4 fingers, right?
Yeah.
Well, cool. Brett, that's all we have time for today. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. If someone wanted to get in contact with you or follow the work that you're doing, how can they do so?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, Brett Price, and I forgot what my actual one is, but I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not one of those cyber geeks that are like, no, because they already have my data. So it's like, whatever. But I'm on LinkedIn. I can also share my email address if you want. Is that okay?
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes if someone wants to get in contact with you and needs some vCISO advice. That'd be great.
Yeah. Brett P at AccessITGroup.com.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the show today, Brett. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If you've made it this far, do me a favor and check out what we do at Sprocket Security. If you're ever in need of a penetration test and you want that hybrid scalable approach, the always testing, always on, not this fake click a button, do a pen test 2 weeks and then do that 5 times a year. No, I mean always on, always testing, latest bleeding edge threat that comes out there, latest exploit, phishing, all the way to, defense evading, covert operations, whatever type of pen test you need. We'll do it as frequently as possible, and we'll also provide a platform for us to interact together. I've devoted the last 5 years of my life to building penetration testing, innovating upon it, and changing it so you can actually do security testing, proactive security testing, in a much better way. Give it a shot. Check us out, www.sprocketsecurity.com.